نبدأ الجلسة الأولى، وبطبيعة الحال يعني من الأمور الصعبة إنه أنت تناقش، يعني إحنا كأكاديميين نناقش الأمور بشكل مختلف، يعني أحياناً يكون بدم بارد وننظر للأمور بدون عاطفة، نحاول نحلل الأمور بشكل موضوعي. هذا يصير أصعب لما تكون أنت في عمق الأزمة وفي وقت الأزمة وفي مكان الأزمة، فتصير في قصة شوي صعبة. واحدة طبعا من تداعيات هذه الأزمة،
one of the repercussions of this crisis, as Dr. Azmi was saying, that we have in the Gulf participant two blocks, the Kuwaitis and the Omanis, and that's all. But nevertheless, we say thank God.
الآن طبعا
Professor Badi, in fact, spoke in the first session and tackled a topic that I am personally studying right now in Latin America, studying the experience there in these countries, which I am visiting for some time, and also the crisis management in Europe. We should not think that the Middle East is only a place of experiments and a political laboratory. No. In Europe, there is a real state problem, and the repercussions of that had led to the referendum about the independence of Scotland or the Catalonia lately, or the North Federation in North Italy. In fact, there are 23 minorities calling for independence inside Europe, and they have an organization in Brussels. Maybe the crisis of the Gulf could be a surprise, or maybe it's not a surprise. Do the Gulf states need each other? I say no, they don't need each other. And maybe this is one of the reasons behind the crisis. Commercial exchange between them is at the minimum. Security doctrine they don't have. There is no unified Gulf states security arrangements. So the crisis can come out at it. In addition to that, the nature of the regimes in the GCC countries, with some exceptions, only small ones in Kuwait, usually the decisions are made on individual levels. And so it's normal to have a crisis. And in addition to that, the crisis is the length or duration. The crisis, the states of the countries of the crisis are rich countries, so they can bear or can go into the crisis for a long time without being affected, and then they look all forward to outside the powers, such as USA, who think that USA is their sole rescue, and he's giving an Arab proverb saying they're going from worse to worse. And then the three Gulf states, with the exception of Bahrain a little bit, have the contradictory projects, three projects. One project is almost complete, which is Qatari project, and the indication is that the Emir, the father, had stepped aside and after going to the conclusion that he has achieved what he wanted. And then there's the Emirates project and the new project of Saudi Arabia. These three projects are contradictory to each other, and they might collide with each other by necessity. And if we suppose that the GCC countries don't need each other and the decisions are individual, so the possibility of collusion is very much. Now there is the possibility of holding the summit in Kuwait, Arab summit in Kuwait, and that might lead to softening or easing the crisis and put an end to it, and in a way that they come back to each other. We have a number of speakers in this sessions, specialized speakers in this, and we'll give each speaker 20 minutes for their presentation, beginning with Gerd, who is Nonneman, who's a master's degree and a PhD holder from Exeter University, and he has studied comparative history in 1980 and also studied in Belgium in 1981. By the way, he is a Belgian, and Belgica has its own problems. Belgium is divided. They have their own problem. For 2 years, they didn't have a government because there were differences for ethnical and ethnic reasons. And he joined Georgetown University in 2012 and is faculty and used to be the CEO of the British Society for Middle East Studies and member of the International Conference for Middle East Studies, and also worked in the private sector in the Gulf states as an advisor in a number of companies and NGOs and for some government agencies. Gerd, I give you the floor.
Okay, so I won't claim that Belgium has no problems. But nevertheless, there's more to life than politics. So in Belgium, there's yet to be fired a single bullet in anger over these things, because people ultimately decide that having a good meal and a drink with family and friends is more important. The secret of Belgium's survival. Picking up on what you just said, in the Gulf, the question of the state problems that you pointed to in the case of Europe and around much of the world, in some senses might be perhaps less important. In the case of, if anything, there's perhaps a reinforcing of national identity, of state identity that we've been seeing very recently in different ways, particularly in the case of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, or perhaps Abu Dhabi. This explicit strengthening of national identity from the top down as a state project has been very, very visible. In the case of Qatar, and I'm saying this just as a preliminary to what my actual presentation, in the case of Qatar, you also see a reassertion of national identity and a strengthening of the state, if anything, but almost as a consequence of the current crisis. So it's much more where bottom-up dynamics are at work. Okay, so with those brief comments, let me turn to my paper. My intention is to look a little bit at the extent to which the current situation reflects change from what we've been used to, and to what extent it still retains the same old patterns that have been in place for nearly a century. So I'll do this by obviously splitting my talk into two pieces, one about before, really up to, say, 2011 or so, and then after, the period 2011 to today, which culminates, as far as the Gulf is concerned, with the current Gulf crisis. So first of all, before, the nature of foreign policy patterns in the region, I would suggest. Oh, and incidentally, I should also preface it by saying I'm simply putting this out here as a few initial thoughts, and then I very much hope that I can learn from my colleagues and all of you in really figuring out what's going on. So feel free to, and in fact, I hope you will come back at this. So the first of 5 points I want to raise for the previous situation is on the nature of foreign policy patterns in this region. And I think, obviously, the first priority of the regimes in these states was always the security of the regime, security of the dynasty, the security of the particular faction that was in power, and the security of the state. Those are the ultimate drivers of foreign policy. And the second feature that was always typical of the nature of foreign policy patterns, I would suggest, was that they would always try to lock in a security guarantor on the outside world, a particular hegemon, and then cultivate complementary relationships. This is something that I think has been going on for over a century. In Kuwait, Qatar, indeed, in Saudi Arabia. So these two patterns, I think, drove foreign policy to a large extent for a very long time. I'd argue that they still do, although I'll come back to that. So the corollary of the second point, that apart from looking for a major external guarantor of security, they would always look for these complementary relationships, is to say that all of these states, perhaps with the partial exception of Bahrain, have always also tried to maintain a level of autonomy, both at the regional and at the global levels. So in other words, while they might be to an extent dependent and might search for certain dependence on external security guarantees, they never saw themselves as without room for maneuver. They actively pursued that room for maneuver. So that's my first observation or suggestion about the state of play before. The second is that what were the threats in recent decades? And what was the perception of threats? They were strategic, ideological, and related to status. Those three categories. Clearly, in terms of strategic threats, Iran and Iraq were always a source of such perceived strategic threats for the smaller states in now the GCC. There was always an ideological threat also emanating in different ways from Iran and from Iraq over the decades. And then in terms of the status threat, Saudi Arabia clearly, or the Al Saud, saw the other big guns in the region, particularly Iraq and Iran, as a threat to its status as a regional power. But for all the others, for the tiddlers, so to speak, in this region, the major strategic and as well as status threat was Saudi Arabia itself. And then amongst the smaller ones, arguably there would have been competition. And one obvious example would be between Abu Dhabi and Qatar, at least the Qatar that emerged in the 1990s. So that's my second suggestion of what defined regional relations in this previous period. And again, it's fairly obvious that a lot of that still applies. Third, there was, or at least there was a perception of a relatively predictable international system. So what Professor Badi was talking about earlier about the change that we've seen, what was there before, where Westphalianism still seemed to rule the roost and where we moved from a bipolar to a monopolar system, unipolar system for a while, with the overweening importance and role of the great powers, that was in place, or at least an assumption of that was still in place. So that, again, defined regional politics. But again, remember that that's balanced by what I said under my second point, which is that these small or middle powers in the Gulf were never simply dependent players. They always had a volition of their own. The fourth suggestion is that, of course, as in all cases of foreign policy, there was a role for agency, and there was a role for the prisms through which the leaderships saw their region. They had these regimes, and indeed arguably these states, had certain role conceptions. How did they view their role in the region and in the world? It's not just about the objective structural surroundings that they find themselves in, but it's also that over time, a certain way of viewing the world became important. Certain role conceptions emerged, and those helped define behavior. Of course, it's not just regimes as a whole or states as a whole that have these conceptions. It's also individual leaders. To state the obvious, the Al Saud always have seen their role on the peninsula as that of the leading power, a role that shouldn't really be challenged. Clearly, in Abu Dhabi, there's been a role conception that emerged particularly since the death of Sheikh Zayed, of Abu Dhabi as a minor regional superpower, and so on. And clearly, Qatar has developed since Sheikh Hamad, especially, a particular view of its own role in the region and the world. So that's the fourth of these suggested dynamics or factors that drive regional politics. The fifth and final one, I just want to say something about the GCC as such. The GCC clearly it was a surprise to many that it survived for as long as it did. But I would argue that as a real common player, or the commonality in foreign policy positions on the part of the GCC was something that only came through at times of peak crisis, of peak threat, or peak threat perception. For instance, Iraq, when Iraq was seen as an overwhelming threat to the interests on the security of the Gulf states, the GCC came together. When Iran was seen at times being such a threat, or perhaps when jihadi strands of politics in the wider region posed a threat. But outside those periods of peak perceived threat that brought them all together under a common threat perception, by and large, they reverted to divided policies because their own perceptions of interest were different. And I suppose the main cleavage within the GCC has always been between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and all the others on the other. For all of the other states, including Abu Dhabi, regardless of what's happening at the moment, Saudi Arabia, I would suggest, was seen as the main potential threat or active threat. So the results of these 5 factors, I would argue, were that there was a persistence in this region, within the GCC region, of bilateral conflicts throughout. But at the same time, these states, to different extents, would use the GCC institutions as a regional forum wherever it could be useful, either at the short term to counter acute threats, or more regularly to allow multiple messages to be sent to different audiences. So the GCC was a very useful forum to send one message to a certain audience while sending different messages at a bilateral level. And that's a very useful tool to have. So in other words, while there was some commonality at times, which was very instrumental, the underlying potential conflicts and frictions were always there. But there's an important note to make, I think, in this. And again, I stand to be corrected if you can come up with other examples. But I think since we left the 1920s, because up to the early 1920s, there was seriously violent conflict. There was an existential threat to Kuwait's existence from the then Al Saud shock troops, or the Ikhwan. But since we left that period, so basically for the last century, I would suggest, whenever there was friction, whenever there were conflicts between the different states that now make up the GCC, there was always a concern to safeguard channels of communication, a concern not to blow up bridges. There were conventions of sheikhly exchange. How do you have honorable exchanges amongst yourselves, even amidst conflict? There was respect for kinship networks, which were a very real and are a very real fundamental factor of regional relations, societal relations as much as anything. And there was an awareness of the common interests of the ruling kinship groups. So we move to the second part of the presentation. What situation are we in now? And I'd suggest again 5 points. The first is that there's been some environmental change. And here I'm very much reminded of what Professor Badi was just talking about. The so-called the end of power politics, the fact that global politics is no longer simply structured by the great powers, and consequently the attempts by regional actors, both state and non-state, to fill this vacuum, and then the inability of the great powers to control those kinds of activities, at least to fully control it. That clearly is something that has changed, not only substantively, but in the perceptions of the local players. So that's worth keeping in mind when we try and explain what's happening now. The Arab Spring has happened. Again, as Professor Badi was explaining, that's influenced perceptions and dynamics. The increased role or confidence of Iran on the regional stage is another one. And then, of course, in line with this broader picture that was sketched earlier this morning, the somewhat declining engagement of the US, but particularly the perception of perhaps and this decline in engagement on the part of the US and an ability of the US to control regional affairs. All of this clearly feels different than it used to. Having said that, neither the kinds of events that happened in the Arab Spring, nor Iran's perceived influence, nor questions about the US's position in this region are actually unprecedented. If you go back to any time since the 1950s, you can see several times when variants of this kind of dynamic also were present. So that's worth still reflecting on. So, second point, what are the threats? To an extent, they're still the same. For the states of the GCC, Iraq remains a potential threat, although in different ways than it used to. Perhaps the very instability, the implosion of power in Iraq might be a threat linked to non-state power, non-state actors, violent non-state actors as a threat, and perhaps ideological threats. Iran remains a potential threat simply by virtue of being there and as large as it is. And of course, it remains potentially, at least in the perception of some on the GCC side, an ideological challenge. For the small states in the Gulf, in the GCC, Saudi Arabia remains a threat. So in many ways, the picture there hasn't really changed. It's just a broader context that has shifted somewhat. So my third comment on the current environment is about role conceptions. To what extent have role conceptions shifted? I would argue that to a large extent they remain very similar, but there's been a perceptible shift in the role conceptions of at least Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi. And then why is this? Clearly they become more assertive in the defense of what they feel or what their leaderships feel are their current interests. And that perhaps links to an extent to the broader contextual picture that we just sketched. The fourth of my 5 points about the current situation is that clearly there's been a divergence in interpretation of threats and of the relative importance, or of the importance of particular threats relative to other aims, interests, and role conceptions. So different regimes have interpreted things differently. I mean, it's stating the obvious, but if you think about the way in which Abu Dhabi, or say Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman have reacted to the post-Arab Spring situation, and particularly to the role of Islamism as one strand in oppositional activity and thinking, and you compare that to the way the Qatari leadership has reacted, there's an obvious example, or indeed Oman or Kuwait. And the fifth point to make is that, again, as before, for the smaller states of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia remains the overweening threat. I would say, even if the Abu Dhabi leadership currently seems to look at Iran as a major threat and paints the Muslim Brotherhood as an existential threat, which I don't think has any basis in fact at all. Nevertheless, and however close they are currently to Saudi Arabia, I am certain that they nevertheless, just below the surface, still regard Saudi Arabia as a challenge and a threat to many of their interests, just as has been the case in the past. So this is clearly all part for the reason for the emergence of the Qatar versus Quartet rift, including up to 2014. But the emergence of this rift, in the case of Qatar and the Quartet, up until that time was still maintaining the old style of conflict management and the conduct of conflict. It still maintained, at least I would suggest, the old modalities, the old safeguards of the earlier period that I listed, at least since 1920. So while there's been change, because clearly we now have this conflict, we have a different context, it still was reflective of these earlier patterns of conflict, patterns of management, patterns of subsequent reconciliation and avenues or openings for reconciliation, etc. So to put it a different way, the fact that there is a conflict in the GCC is not at all new, but something else is. Partly it's as a consequence, I think, of this contextual change that Professor Badi and I earlier sketched. Partly it's two other elements that got space or interacted with that contextual change. One is a change in decision-making structures, particularly in two states. And the other is, of course, individuals. We know, however much foreign policy analysts and political scientists and international relations people might like to think about structures, that nevertheless, volition or agency or individual leadership does play and can play an overwhelmingly important role. So decision-making structures and individuals. I don't really need to tell you about the individuals. We know in the case of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad made a huge difference in Qatar's foreign policy and as well as in domestic development. But of course, in Saudi Arabia, we've seen a generational change. Mohammed bin Salman and his little court around him play a very important role. It's the prism through which they see the world that matters. And finally, in Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, since Sheikh Zayed's passing, has gradually become more confident and imposed his view of the world on Abu Dhabi's and therefore the UAE's policy. So the final thing is the decision-making structures. I think it's not coincidental that this is particularly in really the ones where there has been change in those terms, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The UAE is unique in any case because it's a confederation or a federation. So decision-making was always more diverse. What we've seen there from that old diversity, which I suppose was exemplified by the position of the Al Maktoum on the one hand in Dubai and the Al Nahyan in Abu Dhabi on the other hand, who looked out for each other's interests because it was mutually beneficial relationship, it's now turned into Abu Dhabi, ruling the roost because of all the factors that we know. And within Abu Dhabi, it's really Mohammed bin Zayed, a couple of his brothers, and close advisors. So that's definitely changed. In the case of Saudi Arabia, we also know what changed. In Saudi Arabia, decision-making could be very, very glacial, whether in domestic politics or economics, as well as in foreign policy. And while that had lots of problems, along with it came a tendency to hear different voices, different interpretations. People had to knock heads together or had knocked their own heads together, had to come up with consensus plans, which meant that generally was a very careful deliberation of possibilities. Where we're now, that's completely gone. Now, we're left now with effectively one man with his small court making all the decisions impetuously, arguably, without the benefit of these counter views from around the system. So I think that's pretty much where I could probably leave it. This is then, so I think this drives the changes. This tells us what's still the same and what has changed. And these things have then combined with the momentary needs of the new Egyptian regime under Sisi, the persistence of an intensification of the weakness of Bahrain, particularly of its economy, as well as its social problems, and of course the broader context of the Arab Spring. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Gerd. الآن ننتقل إلى الدكتور ماجد الأنصاري.
Now we move to Dr. Majed Al-Ansari. Dr. Majed, of course, uses the Qatari term, that is blockading Qatar or laying siege to Qatar. But if you look for terms, you'll always find that we in Kuwait have an issue before courts now as a result of some opposers and some say breaking into the national parliament, or is it just entering the building simply? Is it a revolution or is it a coup, whatever? Dr. Majed Al-Ansari is a professor at Qatar University. He writes weekly for Al-Arab newspaper, and he works as an advisor to many charitable organizations. He got his MA from Manchester University and his PhD from the Katimat Center from Manchester University. And now the floor is yours, Dr. Al-Ansari. Thank you very much, Chair, and may the blessings of God be upon you all, and welcome to all our guests here in Doha. First of all, the term you referred to by Dr. Ghanem is not mine, is the Arab Centers. In fact, if we can refer to the screen, you will see we don't know. They use the term blockade of Qatar. I normally use the term Gulf crisis. I think it's pretty much neutral, and which allows us academically, not through the media, to. I use the blockade of Qatar sometimes when I want to use my personal bias, if you like, not the academic approach. The basic idea here for me is I'll try and allude to the causes of the Gulf crisis and its impact and implications. And it seems that someone is trying now to erase the term blockade of Qatar from the screen. There is no need to do that. If you allow me, please, to start with a basic concept here, and that is when we talk about political conflicts, there are always direct and indirect causes. In this crisis in particular, the biggest question is where are the direct causes? The indirect causes are many and they are obvious, and we can discuss later on to justify the discord and differences in this region and the world. All conflicts have a direct cause. Like the First World War was the assassination of the Crown Prince of Austria, etc. What are the direct causes for this Gulf crisis? I can't find any, so maybe in my paper I'll try to discuss this. And I'd first of all like to quote Lance Bennett, which I will use his model for analysis here. Lance is saying you really need to understand an understanding of the political narration or narrative to understand the political causes in official establishments or something. As Dr. Ghanem said, when we differ on terms and terminology, emanates from trying to promote a certain political narrative. I think when a politician stands up before an audience and talks about his causes for conflict with another party, he will talk about everything but the causes, the real causes. So we will try now to understand what goes on behind the scenes. As I promised you, the model I will use is the Bennett model. Bennett identifies political analysis as deconstructing political elements into political actors and resources. He says we have actors who fight over resources. We have resources and we have actors. And if we want to understand what's happening on the ground in conflicts, we have to understand these actors who are part of this conflict and what influence does each one of them exercise or apply, and through that we can understand the reality, or in other words, we can deconstruct the conflict to understand what goes on behind it. So therefore, if we take the Bennett model, is we have to identify or give definition to the political resources as a basis for the political analysis. Who wants what and what's the size of what they want? This is the basis of any political disagreement or conflict in the world, is because some parties want something and the amount or the size of what they want is the basis for the conflict. So we have to understand the resource, and we understand the demand and the availability or the abundance. What decides whether this resource is in abundance or it's scarce and not available is determined by the supply and demand equation. So when we're talking about political resources, we have to understand them as we understand them in economic terms, that these are limited resources. They are not there for everyone to take. And so as political ambition is limitless, and like we do, sometimes some countries decide to limit their own political ambitions, but sometimes this is limited by other reasons. But nonetheless, in any event, political ambitions are there. And every political resource, if it's in demand or the demand increases due to certain political conditions, or this decreases, there is a stability you can build on, and this stability can either be negative or positive. We're not talking about material resources. We're not talking about economic resources or geographic space of land or political presence or activity through parliament. Ideas are resources. Controlling who has the idea and who promotes it is a resource. For this reason, in the Islamic context, you see there is a conflict. Who can control the narrative? Who can say, I'm the one who carries this idea and promote it? In the Western context, there is a conflict and struggle over who controls the liberal narrative and can utilize that to serve his own interests. Changing demand into, or the increase in demand into turning them into problems eases dealing with political problems. So instead of rather saying that I'm in conflict with another political party over a political resource, I make up or invent a problem to say this is the reason why we are in conflict. And sometimes this is done through creating an illusion that this is a problem that can be solved. So if there is an anticipated solution, then people can seek this solution, and then they can negotiate over the political resource behind the scenes and behind closed doors. Solving problems, political problems and political conflicts, in fact, is a redefinition of the supply and demand. And before the conflict, whether political or military, comes into existence, there is some sort of a balance between demand and the availability or abundance. When the balance of power in this sense tilts towards one party, like when there is a balance when every party gets what they want, or on the contrary, one party gets the maximum at the expense of others. How problems are solved? They are solved either through negotiating some principles or laws, or through using the logic of power and conflict. Now, if we use this model for analysis to understand the Gulf crisis, we pose the most important question. What is the most important resource over which this conflict is taking place? If we say we are talking about Qatar and the blockading countries as parties to this conflict, there is one subject on which the conflict has been going on. This actually leads to a question: why has the crisis begun? If there was a subject or a question over which this conflict has started, then there must be something, a reason or cause which led that. The answers can be divided into two. From the blockading countries, the answer or the reply is these countries are supposing that Qatar finances terrorism and supports terrorism, and Qatar interferes in other countries' affairs, and the media discourse incites hatred, and of course the relationship with Iran. Qatar says that there is a difference in the world view and the view to the projects in the region, and there is an attempt for Qatar to capitulate, to make it capitulate to the blockading countries. And so are these replies enough? Let's take these answers one by one and analyze them. Supporting terrorism, financing terrorism, American reports are saying this is a problem which is not exclusively Qatari. I'm not saying that it's exclusively Qatari and Qatar has nothing to do with it. What I'm saying is this is not something particular or peculiar to Qatar only. This is a Gulf problem. The people in the West in general see a problem in this area, and the United States, through its influence, is trying to to pressurize these countries to deal with it. So therefore, this cannot be a real cause for the conflict. As for the relations with Iran, at the level of the Gulf countries, Qatar is not the closest economically or politically to Iran. If we talk about the economics, there is a balance of payment which is very clear. Qatar comes in number 5 in dealing with Iran, and Qatar is not the number 1 partner for Iran, neither is Iran a number 1 partner for Qatar. As for the political relations, Qatar is not the closest to Iran politically. There was a time when Kuwait was closest. Now Oman at the level of political relations is the closest. Qatar withdrew its ambassador from Iran as courtesy to Saudi Arabia. And if there is a real relationship between Qatar and Iran, it's not different or closer than other Gulf countries. At the level of the media discourse, we cannot deny there is a difference in opinion over Al Jazeera. At the Gulf level, they consider Al Jazeera a troublemaker, and even the Emir of Kuwait said that Al Jazeera played a hostile role against his country. But at the same time, we can say that Al Jazeera for 2-3 years did not report on the violations, on human rights abuses and violations in Yemen, for example, as courtesy to Saudi. So we cannot say that. As for interference in other countries' affairs, I think I can safely say that all Gulf countries are guilty. All Gulf countries have interfered in the affairs of other regions. But the Qatari role since 2013 has withdrawn. Qatar has withdrawn from Syria, from Libya, and so if the trend was moving downwards, why this crisis? Qatar is saying that there is a difference in the outlooks and the projects each country runs in the area. This is what Qatar says, but this has been going on since 2008. And the crisis has caused harm at the economic and political level. So therefore, the causes cannot be economic only. All of this comes within the context of differing over a resource and turn it into a problem. So what is the basic and fundamental resource that everyone is differing on? History teaches us that one narrative is the prominent one, and that is political hegemony. I think this conflict, in my opinion, is directly linked to certain parties wanting to exercise hegemony. Historically, these countries were formed from the dichotomy of Saudi Arabia and the other. And historically, the unexpected factor was Abdul Aziz's state going beyond Majed and controlling the Hijaz and establishing a big kingdom. And Abdul Aziz could not go beyond that, and Britain wouldn't allow Saudi to go beyond its borders. So Britain has supported the project of creating the UAE, and of course this does not apply to Oman a lot, because it's a little bit further away, although Oman was always fearful from Saudi expansion, and sometimes these countries used to give in to Saudi Arabia to evade its evil deeds and the dangers coming from Saudi Arabia, and this is more or less normal, and we cannot talk about it as an evil intention on the part of one country or another, but it was part and parcel of the political development and nature of this area. The oldest project here, of course, is the Saudi one, and we have the Kuwaiti project before the invasion. Before the invasion, Kuwait was leading the area in political progression, and Kuwait went beyond the role the Emirates is playing now, and some of the people who wrote about it and called for Kuwait to shrink back into its old strategic size, if you like, after the invasion. And this led to problems when some territorial parts of Kuwait were occupied, like Al-Khafji, and this is all part of fearing Kuwait's political potential, which can create a political impact in there. Of course, there is the Emirati project and the Qatari project. The only difference between the Kuwaiti, Emirati, and Qatari projects, the Kuwaiti or the Qatari is not one wanting to exercise hegemony on the Gulf area through which they can take control, exercise control over political decision on Saudi Arabia. They had a project to go beyond the area and establish political influence in other parts of the world through supporting certain causes. The Emirati project is different. They really want to exercise hegemony over political decision-making within the region, within Saudi Arabia, within Qatar, within Kuwait, within Oman. And this, I think I'm running out of time. So we go back to our original theme. There is the problems on the borders and territorial differences. And in 2017.
ونتيجتها هي ما نراه اليوم على
And the result is what we see now on the ground. The geopolitical situation
دولة مهيمنة جغرافيا أمام دول غنية ونماذج سياسية متشابهة، دول لديها قوة ولديها عوامل قوة كثيرة، ولكن حجمها الجغرافي يجعلها أصغر من غيرها.
Over other countries that are smaller than them. If we look into the players who have projects of influence, some of these countries have projects for hegemony and some of them for influence. The conflict between these different projects has led to the political situation that we are facing today. Why? First of all, that the Saudi Emirates project now is a sort of to implement some political projects that were not possible in the past. And as we said, this crisis was not the result of a political difference between the countries, and then this is also the result of the change of the regime in Saudi Arabia and the change of the political Saudi doctrine on religious level and the nature of the interventions in the region and the fragility of the present alliances that might collapse soon. And this has transferred us from temporary hegemony to other things. Now I'll speak about the different scenarios about the future of this project of hegemony, and this might lead us to real expectations based on the classical scenarios used in political science. The first one is the status quo scenario, which is the continuation of the tensions that exist now and the Cold War in between the GCC countries. Whenever there's any crisis outside the GCC countries, there will be some tension inside the Gulf states. If there are a crisis in Washington or in Europe or in the Asia, that will be reflected on a crisis in the GCC countries. And the second scenario is the success of the hegemonist Emirate Saudi project. These were two projects, one Saudi, one Emirates, but they met together at the Arab Spring. But these two projects would sometimes conflict with each other. If they don't succeed regarding Syria, Iran, Yemen, Saudi will change Saudi Arabia into a regional power, and the Emirates' decision will depend on the agreement with the Saudis. But this is a very long shot as a scenario. We haven't seen any political achievements as a result of this Saudi Emirate project other than creating crises, but it has not been successful in creating any achievements or gains. The last scenario is the scenario of the failure of the hegemonist project. This, in fact, is the result of will be the result of the political behavior of the blockade countries that might think here we're speaking about the collapse of this four parties coalition. We witness now that Egypt is getting out of this or preparing to get out of this four countries alliance against Qatar, and also and this will apply to the Emirates also if they find they don't have any benefits from this cooperation with Saudis. In brief, all the scenarios are dangerous and the four scenarios are negative. The conclusion is that, do I read it or I don't have the time to? The political situation in the region is a continuous crisis since the beginning of the creation of these entities, and that the the objective of this crisis is the hegemonist project. The future of the region is not bright unless there is a big change on the political level in the region, and we come to a sort of cooperation and complementarity, and the acceleration of the conflict in the region is a natural result of the different powers and countries. Thank you for your attentive listening. Thank you, Dr. Majed. In the beginning, I spoke about contradiction of projects. I said that without having read the paper of Dr. Majed, but this is good because it seems they are both followed a sort of logical analysis that is there is actually a contradiction or conflict of projects that say one can, I thought of something and Dr. Majed thought of something. We both came up with the same conclusion. This is something good so that we can think in a different way of how to deal with this crisis without not in a wishful thinking matter, but when we go deep in the topic, we find that it's more complicated than it seems on the surface. Once we know that, we change how we address it. But to keep saying that we are one Gulf and one of things is all right. Now I give the floor to the third speaker, Mr. Mehran Kamrava, who is chronic insecurity in the Gulf. Has prepared his chronic insecurity in the Gulf. He has causes and consequences, and now he's reading his bio and Qatar. He has written so many articles. Qatar, small country, big politics. The modern Middle East, political history since the First World War, Iran's intellectual revolution. I give him the floor.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure being here and to be in such a distinguished panel with my friend Gerd, Nonneman, Dr. Majed, and Dr. Ghanem, whose scholarship I've long been a fan of. Building up on the discussion that we heard earlier this morning from Professor Badi and from my co-panelists, I wanted to say a couple of things about some of the structural reasons for the pervasive insecurity in the Gulf region. The latest episode and the crisis that we see is part, as we have heard earlier today, of a broader pattern of developments that have historically coalesced to make this region chronically insecure. And I wanted to spend some time thinking about, collectively, some of the reasons for this pervasive insecurity. There are 4 reasons that the Gulf region is so pervasively insecure. I'll talk about each of these, and then I'll offer some thoughts as to what might be lying ahead. First and foremost, the emerging security architecture of the Gulf region has been a source of instability, ironically. The way that security arrangements have evolved in the region have resulted in pervasive insecurity. By and large, up until a couple of months ago, the assumption that informed Gulf security was based on a zero-sum game. And that zero-sum game was based on excluding Iran from the regional security architecture. This exclusion of what is undeniably one of the largest countries in the Gulf, and attempts, constant attempts, at isolating Iran resulted in pervasive insecurity. It resulted in Iran trying to compensate or reintegrate itself into some sort of regional security architecture. Up until the final months of the Obama administration, United States and GCC strategic thinking was premised on the assumption that Iran does not have any legitimate security concerns of its own. As if Iran didn't exist. There was this black hole up there that didn't exist. So that exclusion of Iran from the regional security architecture up until the final months of the Obama administration, and now in the Trump administration, has been one of the pervasive reasons for insecurity. A second reason is the fact that there is a widespread neglect of security threats that are not strictly military in nature. What we've seen over the last several years, particularly in the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, is the emergence of identity politics in general and sectarianism in particular. Now, utilization of sectarianism by state and non-state actors for purposes of mobilizing support, for covering up their own shortcomings, for claiming to be defenders of threatened identities and communities has become a pervasive factor, a pervasive feature of regional politics, both in Iran, in the north of the Gulf, and in the Arabian Peninsula, across Arabian Peninsula countries. Now, sectarianism has re-emerged in the Middle East. I think it's important to remember that sectarianism or sectarianization was first utilized by the colonial powers. The French used it in the Levant and in North Africa, and the British used it in Mandatory Palestine, all for purposes of weakening Arab nationalism. And in the 1950s, 1960s, and the 1970s, sectarianism took a back seat, first to Arab nationalism, then to political Islam, and of course it has re-emerged in the current era. It re-emerged, of course, so re-sectarianization re-emerged in earnest. First, it was utilized for political purposes in Bahrain, and quickly it was adopted by Saudi Arabia. In Bahrain, an uprising was framed in sectarian forms by the government. It was then adopted by Saudi Arabia to defeat or to quell the so-called Saudi Spring in the eastern province. But then it wasn't simply an instrument of political power. It caught on among social actors by wildfire. It was taken up by what many scholars call identity entrepreneurs, who for their own purposes framed their own discussions in a sectarian frame. Now we see, beginning in Bahrain, we have a Sunni resectarianization that was in turn picked up by a Shia resectarianization, first by the Assad regime, although Assad, of course, is Alawi, and many Shia don't accept Assad as Alawi, as Professor Badi mentioned earlier today. But then the attempts of the Iraqi government, or Iraqi government's inattention, deliberate inattention to the predicament of the Sunnis, resulted in the resectarianization of the Iraqi body politic. And then, of course, more recently, what we see is that Iran has established and mobilized the Fatimiyun Brigade, which is made up of Shia Iraqi refugees and Pakistanis. So a sectarianization or resectarianization that started in the aftermath of the 2000 Arab uprising in Bahrain, and then from Bahrain to Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, has now also been picked up by Iran for its own political purposes in places like Iraq and Syria. So identity politics is yet another reason why the region has now become particularly insecure, and insofar as identity politics is concerned, in specific sectarianization or sectarianism. Now, Doha Institute and other centers have done an awful lot of really impressive work looking at the unique threat that nationals in the Arabian Peninsula feel when there are minorities in their own country. And that sense of minoritization by national populations in places like Qatar and in the United Arab Emirates has in more recent years been subsumed. It has been overwhelmed by this larger dynamic of identity politics, namely sectarianism, but that, of course, is just as important and as much of a source of insecurity nonetheless. A third source of pervasive insecurity is the belligerence of the actors involved. Agency, as Gerd mentions, matters. And what we see is oftentimes across the region ambitions of regional hegemony. Of course, we're seeing that in most pronounced way in what is happening, the policies being pursued in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. But this is nothing new. And this pursuit of regional hegemony by different actors, state actors across the Middle East, has been a chronic factor in Middle East, in regional politics. But it isn't just regional hegemony or ambitions of hegemony that has resulted in stability. It is also a desire to follow foreign policies that have been independent. One might argue credibly, for example, that the most recent crisis between Qatar on the one hand and United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia is because the UAE and Saudi Arabia want to turn Qatar into another Bahrain, a country that does not have a foreign or security policy of its own, but is a pleasant vacation destination. And so they can come and enjoy some quality time in some of the five-star hotels here, but a country that doesn't have an independent foreign policy of its own, pretty much like Bahrain. And so attempts at pursuing an independent foreign policy also have been a thorn on regional politics. You might argue that Iran has done the same thing. The rest of the Gulf region sees Iranian policy as hegemonic. If you sit in Tehran and look outside of Tehran and you see American bases encircling the country and the American Fifth Fleet in Manama and the rest of the region, you might see a different perspective. You might have a different narrative. And of course, personal animosities and dislikes have been a factor in regional politics. Again, personal animosities or family animosities are nothing new. There has been now, in recent years, there's been a generational turnover in the Arabian Peninsula, in the region's political leadership. And new leaderships have upended long-established patterns of rule and legitimacy. So, combined with sectarianism on the one hand, and the proliferation of weak states on the other hand, places like Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Iraq, personal ambitions and initiatives have made the region particularly volatile because these weak states have provided petri dishes for these ambitious politicians to further their own pursuits and their own ambitions. Last, but by no means least, perhaps the most important cause of chronic insecurity has been a pervasive security dilemma. The fact that security-producing initiatives in one country deepens feelings of insecurity in another country. And so that other insecure country engages in its own security-producing initiatives, which in turn perpetuate a vicious cycle. And so what we see across the region is this vicious cycle of security and insecurity producing initiatives that have resulted in a regional arms race across the region. Of course, the West has been quite the beneficiary of this regional arms race, eagerly selling weapons, billions of dollars every other week. We hear of a new record being broken in arms sales, and the Iranians, for their part, because they cannot buy arms from the West, they've had a robust domestic missile program. And this vicious cycle has been perpetuated. So on the one hand, we have a regional security architecture that has not been regional in scope. It has been quite exclusionary. It has excluded some at the expense of others. We have personal ambitions and the role of agency. We have security dilemma. And of course, we have the pervasiveness in more recent years of identity politics in general and sectarianism in particular, and the visceral distrust that has emerged among regional actors, all in very close proximity of one another. That distrust, of course, is very important. So what happens as we look ahead? Now, I want to highlight 4 questions or 4 independent variables that are important to look at as we look ahead in terms of what the regional security architecture might look like. I just want to end with 4 question marks. I don't think anybody who can look into a crystal ball and tell you what the region will look like in 5 to 10 years really knows what they're talking about. So first is the role of the United States. The first question mark or the first variable is the role of the United States. What will be the nature of American engagement with the region in the years to come? Are we going to see more of the Trump doctrine, which appears to be in the form of hands-off, let the Saudis do whatever they want to do so long as there's a Saudi-Israeli love affair? Or are we going to see a re-emergence of the Obama doctrine in the post-Trump era in either 3 years or in 7 years? And this re-emergence of the Obama doctrine, of course, we all know what it was like. Earlier this morning, we were reminded of the Obama doctrine, leading from behind, the Asia pivot, and letting the region be in charge of its own security. As you remember, Obama famously said, "I cannot stand free riders or freeloaders," and of course said, the Saudis have to learn to live with the Iranians. And this was in that famous interview that he gave as he was about to leave office. Or are we going to see Jared Kushner running around and trying to organize the region based on a Kushnerite foreign policy or a Kushnerite American policy, as we see? A second question mark that nobody can answer meaningfully is the policies and posture of Iran. How, if at all, will impending changes in domestic politics in Iran affect the country's foreign policy and, in particular, its regional priorities? What I am talking about is the health and age of Khamenei, Ali Khamenei, who is ultimately in charge of Iranian foreign policy and Iranian security policy. Within Tehran, there's a very robust debate about post-Khamenei Iran. What is it going to look like? Is it more of the same, or are we going to see a new personality re-emerge or emerge, and that new personality will divert from what we have seen? But more immediately, are we going to see the Rouhani consensus-based presidency hold, or is the tenuous consensus within Iranian politics that Rouhani has been able to strike, will that consensus break apart? Rouhani's political genius has been in the fact that he has been able to create a consensus within the different factions within the Iranian body politic. Those factions include 4 or 5 different groups. First and foremost, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Second, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis. Third, the executive branch, all the people who report to Rouhani, and these are leftovers from the Hashemi Rafsanjani presidency. And, of course, presiding over all of this is the supreme leader. So these 4 groups have all coalesced under the Rouhani presidency around the question of the nuclear agreement. And the trade-off has been, the red line has been Iran's missile program. So if the Americans and the European Union now start changing the goalpost and say, well, now we want to, as Macron has been going around. He doesn't talk about arms reduction in the GCC because he's happily selling arms to the rest of the GCC, but he isn't selling anything to Iran, so he talks about Iranian missile reduction. So if the European Union and the Americans all of a sudden say Iran has to abandon or curtail its missile program, Rouhani's consensus-based presidency is going to, that consensus is going to break up. And that, of course, becomes important because it then raises the other question, how is the IRGC going to react, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps? Already the IRGC has said, if the Europeans join the Americans in advocating limitations on the missile program, that the IRGC's missile range will reach Europe. And so I think that's important. A third question and a third variable, which we do not know, is the future of the GCC in general and the direction of Saudi politics in particular. Now, I think it is fair to say, I think it's safe to assume, that the GCC as a collective security organization is gone. I think it is also safe to assume that the GCC as a meaningful mechanism for regional integration is gone. I think it's very safe to assume that the GCC as a pleasant forum for exchanging pleasantries and drinking sweet tea will continue for the foreseeable future. I don't think anybody wants to see the death of the GCC. I think Qatar and, of course, Oman and even Saudi Arabia, even Bahrain will not necessarily want to be seen responsible as the country that finally brought about the death of this rather artificial security organization. But I don't think we're going to see GCC re-emerge as a meaningful forum for either security, coordinating security, or for fostering regional integration. Maybe around the margins, movement of individuals, visa regulations, maybe monetary union at some point in the distant future. This, of course, hinges partly on Mohammed bin Salman and whether or not his initiatives, his very ambitious initiatives, will succeed. It is fair to assume that Mohammed bin Salman's ambitious foreign policy has been so far an unmitigated failure. Whether it is the war in Yemen, the embargo in Qatar, the forcible resignation of Saad al-Hariri, or any other, or the competition with Iran and Saudi attempts at being a meaningful player in Syria. All of those have reached a deadlock. However, all indications are that domestically he might succeed, that his attempt at dismantling the deep state in Saudi Arabia, these multiple princes that he has held hostage, all indications are that he's going to succeed in carrying on his domestic attempts. And last but by no means least, the final question mark that I think is important is the future outlook for energy and the resources. In other words, is this region going to maintain its strategic relevance for Europe and the United States and Asia, or alternative energy sources going to make the region strategically another Africa? I think given the region's investments, given the region's continued importance, I think we should not write the strategic obituary of the Gulf region. I think the Gulf region will continue to remain important for some time to come. And of course, what we're likely to see is continued instability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehran, for this illuminating thoughts. I think being the with the diet awareness, I don't think people will be keen on sweet tea anymore. But الآن طبعا احنا شوي يعني متأخرين.
We are a little bit late in time, but we can give, as I have received the instructions, I can give 20 minutes to questions and comments, but anybody who wants to raise a question or comment, please be short, specific. We want peaceful shots, rockets. Sharif Al-Ahya'i from Oman. Thank you very much. All the panelists have analyzed the situation and the crisis of Qatar and its relations with GCC. I think everybody is aware, and everybody knows that there is no one GCC country that is innocent from the accusations made, especially in Dr. Majed's paper. We are all part of this crisis, and we are all active elements in it. But this pessimism, I think, we should be changed into something positive. Let's consider this a wake-up call for all the nations of the region. The illusion we had lived since the beginning of the creation of GCC was not in good for or beneficial for the countries. It was a relation of hegemony in which some countries benefited, and the peoples believed what was said. Now, the big drift is useful for the peoples of the region to know what illusions we have, and we should be optimistic that we are waiting for this crisis to open doors for us, the open doors of reality, because now we do have the awareness, because what happened was something expected right from the beginning of the creation of GCC countries, and then the union, then the integration, and the currency, unified currency. Those were the dreams and illusions that were encouraged by countries. So I think a person like this had this positive and useful for the peoples of the GCC countries. We've lost some of the confidence in the governments, but we can rebuild that because now we are aware of what's happening around us. I can't see the people who are in the back because the lights are in my eyes. As for those on the sides, I can hardly see any one of them. Naif, a student in this institute, a question to Mr. Majed. Is the non-intervention of Qatar in regional issues in 2013 reflects that Qatar was aware or were feeling that there will be a crisis in the Gulf? Mr. Majed gave a very wonderful, Dr. Zakaria Matar. I was the head of the scientific council in Peshawar University. Right now, I am an economic advisor. Mr. Majid's lecture was great, but it should not be here. I followed up this crisis, and I found that has no real rational or scientific reasons or basis. There are 300,000 Egyptians here who transfer their money to Egypt. Qatar has not withdrawn its investments in Egypt. The gas continuing. The leadership of Al Jazeera channel are from the countries of the blockade. The only case And the only case is one problem, it's the problem of the Arab Spring. It's the war between freedom, social justice, freedom of expression on one hand, and the tyrannic regimes on the other hand, and Qatar taking the side of the freedom and the freedom of speech. Please, you must keep in mind we must put an end to the session in 10 minutes. Thank you, and I thank everybody. My question is to Dr. Majed. In your scenarios, you spoke as if we are in the last round of the different projects in here, while as if we study the different variables of the crisis, there might be other scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John Duke Anthony. My question is to Dr. Mehran. Your works have made major contributions to the literature aimed at understanding this region. However, I take issue with 2 points that I think are important. One is that you imply or allow the audience to infer that the United States has been pivoting from the region, or is pivoting from the region, or intends to pivot from the region. I will concede that this is the perception, but this is a case where perception does not equal fact. On the contrary, the United States is becoming as entrenched as before, and yet it's not perceived. There are more American armed forces here than any other place in the world. The world remains accustomed to thinking, no, they're in Japan, Germany, South Korea. Not so. They're here. Secondly, the thesis that the GCC, in order to be effective, could not be effective absent the inclusion of all the region's member countries. No, sounds nice, has a good cadence to it, but I believe that's not true either. If Iran was a member of the GCC, that in itself would kill the GCC. Just as in the European Union, had the countries in the Warsaw Pact been members, it too would have sunk the EU. And in Asia, had Communist China been a member before it liberalized, it would have sunk the regional security arrangements in East Asia. Thank you.
You. تفضل.
Mohammed Sharqawi, professor in George Mason University, Washington. My question is, Dr. Ansari, I understand you're focusing on the relation between the political narrative to understand the political project. But I think any hegemony project or colonialization on the French style or British style or the Americans' invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq always had been based on a zero-sum equation. So I think there are two readings. One, as you said, is outside to dismantle the elements of this force that fuels the project of hegemony, but also the reading of inside this project of hegemony. So if we suppose that there is an Emirati Saudi project for hegemony on the Gulf states, what is the structure of this hegemony? How do you see it from inside the decision makers who gives a new conception of a situation different of the GCC countries? One last question, two last questions.
Thank you. Hugh Miles, editor of Arab Digest website. I wanted to ask the panel about the way that the future of Saudi Arabia, because it seems to me that they are running out of money. And if you look at their reserves before the oil crash in 2014, it was something like 700 and something billion, and now it's at 400 and something billion, and they continue to hemorrhage money. So it seems inevitable that within 3 or 4 years they're going to be bankrupt. Now, I'd be interested to know the panel's comments on this, whether they agree with this thesis, and if they do, how is this going to manifest itself? Thank you.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
السلام
أنا
عليكم.
الحقيقة اللي عتاب شديد جدا على تفضل فيه الأستاذ اللي بجامعة جورجتاون.
I have some strong criticism against the gentleman from Georgetown. Bahrain is not just a tourist attraction. He should apologize. Mr. Muhammad Al-Ftaimi. Do you want to, you have 3 seconds to say it, or shall I read your comment? I'm talking about international order, which is disintegrated more or less. Most countries are moving towards a multi-polar system, and this applies to small countries in the Middle East as much as it applies to Eurasia and other parts of the world. These countries are trying to maybe protect themselves. Doesn't this give the Gulf countries or any other country the right to search for a place for themselves in the world, in a world which is multipolar and whereby there is all this competition and conflict over their interests? The question is, doesn't this give the right to Gulf countries to enter this conflict without much regard to ethics and political ethics? Nobody so far has spoken about the United States retreat from the area after 9/11. Wouldn't this lead to these powers appearing? Where is the role of the United States in creating or striking a balance from 2001 until now? These are the questions I'm trying to Doctor, please, if you allow me. You talked about GCC's role being on the retreat and it's waning. Maybe it's on its way to be totally diminished. Wouldn't this necessarily need to new alliances within the Gulf countries, that each country will seek for an ally? And wouldn't this lead ultimately to exasperating the conflict? Thank you. We'll give the panelists a minute each. I don't know. This is a Gulf crisis. Solve it in 1 minute if you can. Dr. Majed, because most questions were directed to you. Maybe this is because I spoke Arabic. As for Mr. Muhammad's question, was there a sense of imminent danger? The question is yes. Sheikh Tamim found himself, in a way, trying to be courteous with his neighbors to create some political stability. Why I use the word inevitable? Because there are three different scenarios, conflicting scenarios. One of these scenarios says that this project will fail, the other sees it as a success, possibility to succeed. This is a classical division in political analysis. I cannot exclude any scenario, but I don't think it will be outside these three scenarios. Either it will be positively moving towards a solution, or negatively to stagnation, or things will remain. As for the other gentleman's question, I need an entire lecture to respond to, but there are other modules of analysis we can follow, but this is the one, the Bennett one, that I chose. And there is a lot of talk about the impact of Saudi and Emirati policies, but it's outside the scope of the analysis model I chose. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, Dr. Anthony, I completely agree with you. The United States isn't going anywhere. Military relations are at an all-time high. The U.S. Military presence is only being deepened. And as you mentioned, there's only an assumption, a mistaken assumption, that the Obama administration, at least, was on its way out. So I completely agree with you, and probably I should have explained that more clearly, my position. I also didn't mean to imply that the GCC ought to have included Iran, but the GCC strategic thinking up until not that long ago, that Iran had no legitimate, well, not all of the GCC. Of course, Oman has always been different, and Qatar has hedged its relationship with Iran. But the larger assumption that informed the security architecture, that Iran was a black hole, of course, is what I was talking about. And that's not to say that Iran and a very active and engaged GCC on its own, robust GCC as a meaningful collective organization, security organization, would be necessarily mutually exclusive. Bahrain as a tourist destination, that's what the Saudis want. No, I didn't say it is, but that's what the Saudis want to turn Qatar into. They do not want Qatar to have an independent foreign policy of its own. And when Qatar pursues independence, an independent foreign policy that engages in its environment, that's what irks the Saudis. And I think we can go back and forth about the fundamental differences between Qatari and Bahraini foreign policy. Bahrain piggybacks on the back of Saudi Arabia. Qatar plays its own fiddle, and I think that cannot be denied. And then finally, in terms of re-emergence of, or a re-emerging Gulf security architecture, I think we have yet to see. I don't think, in this Gulf crisis, oftentimes we drive around in Doha and we see pictures of Erdogan. One thing to keep in mind is that Turkey is using this as an opportunity to sign long-term contracts with Qatar. It's not that they are engaging or coming to the rescue of Qatar out of the kindness of their heart. So Turkey's presence, commercial, diplomatic, military, and otherwise, in Qatar at least, is going to be a long-term phenomenon. We have yet to see what the long-term relationship between Qatar and Iran will be. Qatar and Iran have always had a functional relationship with one another, kind of on very specific issues, the gas field, kind of specific issues of trade. So does this mean a new regional alignment? We have to wait and see.
Thank you. Gerd, 1 minute, please.
Thank you. On that last point, my answer was part of the last part of my paper, which it turns out I completely forgot to include. I thought I was back at the beginning where I wasn't. But anyways, that's just as well. The thing about is there a new alliance structure emerging here with Qatar and Iran and so on? My answer would be no, there's not. It's a functional relationship that's changing shape. The divergence of interests between Qatar and Iran will always be there. So, but it's a relationship that's ever more essential to be managed. A modus vivendi is crucial, just like Oman has assessed that relationship. The other point I'd make very quickly on your paper earlier, the re-sectarianization of the region, and you listed an early example in Bahrain and then Saudi Arabia. I'd say actually the first example of that I saw was in Yemen, and it was Ali Abdullah Saleh purposely defining the Houthis, or the Zaydis, or certainly the Houthis, as Shia, which really started that out. On Saudi Arabia, I think you're right to be concerned about the Saudi domestic futures. It's true, as Mehran said, that I think Mohammed bin Salman is succeeding, or is in the process of probably partially successfully disassembling or dismantling the deep state of the old Al Saud as it was constituted. But success domestically really will require creating lots of jobs, which means the Vision 2030 has to be a comprehensive success within the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, within the next 5 years, really, you've got to start to see serious results, precisely because of this budgetary issue. And that requires two things: a consistent willingness on the part of the domestic private sector to invest hundreds of billions of dollars for the long term, and a consistent willingness on the part of external investors to invest hundreds of billions of dollars quickly for the long term. Both of them, I think, are doubtful, or at least the extent to which these need to be realized are doubtful because of the arbitrary way, the extra-legal way he's gone about the current anti-corruption push. So I think that the upshot of that is that however much I wish Vision 2030 would become a reality, and a lot of the population wishes it were too, I'm doubtful that it will to the extent necessary to avoid future ructions socially. So I think in 5 years hence we'll be in a tricky area. So finally on, I'm with John Duke Anthony and Mehran on saying that whatever the perceptions, the US isn't going anywhere, but also in the foreign policies of these states, the US will remain central as an external security guarantor. That doesn't mean that these other complementary alliances will not also at the same time become more important, although it will not take the shape of alliances, as I just tried to suggest, between Qatar and Iran. The final thing to say is that the GCC, because that's your point, and that was just been raised several times, I don't think the GCC has any hope of ever recovering a role in terms of collective security or conflict management, while it will formally remain in existence because the underlying trust has been fundamentally broken, and particularly the always existing view amongst the smaller states of Saudi Arabia as a hegemon that is bent on using the GCC purely in its own interests has been confirmed. So foreign policies of all these states will, and this is my final word, will become much
I'll use
reasserted.
my personal relationship with you and stop you there. شكرا طبعا للمتحدثين.
Thank you very much, all our panelists, Dr. Majed, Mehran, Gerd, and taking into account that because we are here, take into account the timing and the country we're in, I think we had a reasonable and a rational discussion. All speakers and panelists said what they wanted to say. So thank you very much, all of you, and God bless.